Every morning for 34 years, a woman named Renee Caldwell in Columbus, Ohio, woke up and went about her day with a specific, unnameable sense that something in the architecture of her life was slightly off-center, not broken, not absent, just slightly to the left of where it was supposed to be, the way a picture hangs almost straight and you only notice in certain light. She had a husband, a career she loved, a family who had chosen her before she could choose anything, and a life that was full in every measurable way. But there was something she could not locate and could not name, which she had learned to understand as simply the particular texture of being adopted, the knowledge that somewhere in the world there was a version of her origin story that she did not have access to, and that she had made peace with not having it, mostly in the way that people make peace with things they cannot change and continue forward. And every morning for those same 34 years, a woman named Claudette James in Indianapolis, Indiana, who had never heard the name Renee Caldwell and had no reason to, woke up and went about her own day with an almost identical sense that she was carrying a shape she could not fill, something in the outline of herself that had no corresponding piece, a space she had learned to work around the way you work around a room with a missing piece of furniture. You just stop noticing the empty corner eventually. Or you think you do. Neither woman knew the other was alive. Neither woman knew that they had been born in the same hospital, in the same hour, on the same day, in the same city 34 years ago. And that the reason the shape was unfillable was that the missing piece was standing at a podium 12 feet away on the stage of Family Feud in Atlanta, Georgia, on a Tuesday in September, and that the man with the microphone had been given a piece of paper 20 minutes ago that changed everything both of them had ever understood about who they were. It was a Tuesday in September at the Fremantle Studios in Atlanta. The studio was the way it always was, warm, loud, the particular pre-game energy of a crowd that has been looking forward to this for weeks. Two families faced each other, the Caldwell family from Columbus, Ohio, anchored by Renee, 34, in a burgundy top, her husband Marcus beside her, her sister-in-law, and two cousins completing the line. And across the stage, the James family from Indianapolis, Indiana, anchored by Claudette, CJ, as she had been called her whole life, 34, in a navy top, her mother Vivian beside her, her aunt and two cousins completing their line. Steve had opened with both families, done the warm-up banter, found the energy in each. Renee was quick and precise and laughed at her own answers the moment after she gave them, which was charming. CJ was steady and warm, and had the specific attentiveness of someone who is always scanning the room for what people need, which Steve had noticed immediately. The game had moved through the first two rounds normally. Everything was exactly what it was supposed to be. During the commercial break after the second round, a production assistant had walked to Steve's mark and handed him a folded note. Steve had read it. He had read it again. He had looked up and found Renee at the left podium and CJ at the right podium. And he had looked at them the way you look at something when you are trying to see what you have been told is there and cannot quite locate it yet, and then suddenly can. He had asked for 2 minutes. He had verified the information with the segment producer. He had walked back to his mark and stood there for a moment alone in the way he stood when he was deciding how to do something that had never been done before. The note said that the genealogy service the show had partnered with for a special segment, a DNA matching initiative that all contestants had consented to as part of their participation agreement, the results of which were typically shared weeks after taping, had returned an urgent flag on 2 contestants in the current taping. The flag indicated a sibling match at the identical twin level. The 2 contestants were Renee Caldwell and Claudette James. Steve walked back to the stage. The cameras rolled. He stood at his mark. He said, "I need to stop the game for a minute." He looked at Renee. He looked at CJ. He said, "I'm going to need both of you to come to the center of the stage." Neither woman moved at first. The instruction was unusual enough that both of them looked to their families for a reference point. Their families had none to offer. They walked to the center. They stood 3 feet apart. These two 34-year-old women in burgundy and navy, both healthcare workers, both with the same careful posture and the same slight tilt of the head when they were listening closely, which Steve could see now that they were standing together, and which had not been visible from 12 feet of game show distance. Steve looked at them both. He said, "I'm going to tell you something, and I need you to just hear it before you respond." He paused. He took a breath. The DNA program we run with our genealogy partner returned a result about 20 minutes ago. A result that couldn't wait until after the taping to share. He looked at Renee. He looked at CJ. He said, "You are identical twins." The studio fell completely silent. Neither woman spoke. Renee looked at CJ. CJ looked at Renee. The specific, unhurried way they looked at each other, not with shock exactly, but with the expression of people encountering an explanation for something they have been carrying without a name for 34 years, was the thing that the cameras caught, and that 300 people in that room watched, and that would be replayed more than any other single moment in the clip. They looked at each other the way you look at the missing piece when you finally find it, not surprise, but recognition. Not "where have you been," but "there you are." CJ said, barely above a whisper, looking at Renee's hands, "She has my hands." The studio fell completely silent for the second time. Steve Harvey turned away from the cameras. He pressed his handkerchief to his face. He stood with his back to the room for 6 seconds. The crew members would count them later, because they had nothing else to do with their hands in those 6 seconds except count. But nobody in that studio knew what was about to happen next. The backstory of how Renee and CJ had arrived at those two podiums simultaneously required understanding two parallel lives that had been running in the same direction without knowledge of each other for 34 years. Renee had been born at Methodist Hospital in Indianapolis at 4:47 in the morning on a November Thursday. Her twin had been born 11 minutes later. Their birth mother was 20 years old and unmarried and had made the decision in the weeks before the birth that she could not raise 2 children. She had believed, had been counseled to believe, in the specific careful language of 1990 closed adoptions, that giving one child a family she could not provide was an act of love. She had kept the firstborn. She had given the second to a closed adoption agency. She had been told the child would go to a good home. She had not been told anything else, because in 1990, that was how it worked. The child who went to a good home was Renee. The Caldwells of Columbus, Ohio, Robert and Margaret, a high school principal and a librarian, had received her at 6 days old. They had given her everything they had in the specific way of parents who have wanted a child long enough that when the child finally arrives, they understand exactly what they have and treat it accordingly. Renee had grown up knowing she was adopted. She had asked the questions children ask and received the honest answers her parents could give, which were not many, because the adoption was closed and the records were sealed. She had made peace with the sealed records the way she made peace with most things, thoughtfully, gradually, without pretending the peace was complete. She had gone into physical therapy because she liked the specific satisfaction of helping a body remember how to do what it was built to do. She had met Marcus in her 3rd year of graduate school. She had built a life in Columbus that was full in every measurable way. She had, sometimes, in certain light, noticed the slightly off-center feeling and sat with it and moved on. The child who was kept was CJ. Vivian James had raised her daughter alone in Indianapolis with the specific, determined resourcefulness of a 20-year-old who has made a decision she cannot unmake and has decided that the best response to an unmakeable decision is to make everything that comes after it as good as she can. She had worked. She had finished her own degree at night while CJ was in school. She had built a life that was different from the one she had imagined at 20 and better in most ways, and quieter in one specific way that she had never been able to fully close. She had told CJ, when CJ was old enough to ask, that she had been premature and that there had been another baby who had not survived. She had said it carefully, in the way of a woman who has practiced this sentence many times and has convinced herself it is the merciful version of the truth. CJ had believed her. CJ had grown up with a mother who loved her completely, and a family that was warm and present, and an inexplicable, persistent sense of a shape she could not fill, which she had attributed to the ordinary losses of life. Her grandmother's death, a friendship that had ended badly, the ordinary accumulation of things that leave marks, and had never attributed to the correct source because she did not know the correct source existed. CJ had become a nurse. She said later, in an interview, that she had always been drawn to the moment when people came out of surgery, the specific, vulnerable moment of waking into a world that had just done something major to you. The moment when the first face you see matters enormously. She said she wanted to be a good first face. She had been doing this for 9 years. She was, her colleagues said, the nurse that patients asked for by name. Neither woman had known, filling out the Family Feud application, that they were filling out the same form. Neither had known they would be assigned to opposing families for the same taping date. The genealogy service's matching algorithm had flagged the result 40 minutes into the taping, and the producer had verified it and walked the note to Steve during the break. And Steve had stood at his mark alone and understood that what was about to happen was the reason, sometimes, that television exists. Vivian James was in the studio audience. She had come as CJ's family, her mother in the third row, in a floral blouse, proud and happy, with no knowledge that the woman at the left podium was the daughter she had told CJ had not survived. She had been watching the game. She had been clapping for CJ's answers. She had been watching Renee without knowing what she was watching. Steve turned back to the room. He looked at Vivian in the third row. He said, "Gently, ma'am. I need you to come to the stage." Vivian came. She walked up the stage side steps with the careful step of a woman who does not know what is being asked of her, but trusts the man asking. She stood on the stage. She looked at CJ, who looked back at her with an expression that said, "What is happening, Mama?" Then Vivian looked at Renee. The studio fell completely silent for the third time. Vivian put both hands over her mouth. She made a sound that was not a word. She looked at Renee, really looked at her, the way she had not permitted herself to look since the moment she had walked away from Methodist Hospital 34 years ago, and had been telling herself a sentence ever since that she now understood was not true. Steve said, "Vivian, this is Renee." Vivian said, "I know." She said it immediately, without hesitation. She said it the way you say something you have known for 34 years and have been calling by the wrong name. Steve said, "She's healthy, she's here. She has a husband and a career, and people who love her." Vivian nodded. She was crying without sound. The specific silent crying of a woman who has had decades of practice managing the things she is crying about. She looked at Renee. She said, "I'm sorry. I told her you didn't make it. I was wrong to say that. I've been wrong about that for 34 years, and I'm sorry." Renee looked at this woman, her birth mother, 20 years old when Renee was born. 54 now, standing on a game show stage in Atlanta trying to say the unsayable, and she said, okay. Just that. Okay, not forgiveness, not condemnation, not the beginning or end of anything, just, I hear you. I'm here. Okay, Steve sat down on the stage floor, both hands flat on the stage surface. His head bowed. The camera caught his profile. He was not performing anything. He stood up. He said, I need to tell you something. He looked at Renee and CJ, standing 3 feet apart, still looking at each other, with the recognition that had no name for it in the English language. When I was at my lowest, when I had nothing, when I was sleeping in my car and I didn't know if tomorrow would be different from today, I used to think, does anyone know I'm here? Does anyone share this existence with me? Does anyone in the world have the same shape as me? He paused. I didn't know it was a question with an answer. You both had the answer to each other's question your entire lives. You just didn't know the question had been asked. He looked at them. You've been here all along. He pulled his phone. He called the Genealogy Services Family Reunification Coordinator, a woman named Dr. Patricia Cole, who had worked with the show's partnership for 2 years and who answered immediately because she had been waiting for this call since the flag came through 40 minutes ago. Steve put her on speaker. Dr. Cole said, I want both of you to know that our team is available to support this process in whatever way is useful. Counseling, documentation, any administrative needs related to the adoption records. Whatever you need, we're here. She said it simply and directly, which was the right register. Steve ended the call. But Steve wasn't done. He turned to Renee's family, Marcus, the sister-in-law, the cousins, who had been standing at the left podium through all of this in complete stillness. Marcus, Renee's husband, stepped forward. He walked across the stage to CJ and said, I don't know what the right thing to say is, but I'm glad you exist. And I'm glad she's not alone in whatever this is going to be. He stepped back. CJ's aunt, her mother Vivian's sister, who had been in the audience and had been brought to the stage by a production assistant during Steve's call, walked to Renee and took both her hands and looked at her face and said, We've been missing you. We didn't know we were missing you. But we were. Steve announced both families received the full prize. He said it quickly because it was the smallest thing that had happened in the last 30 minutes, and it deserved to be said quickly. He turned to the camera. He said, I want to talk to everyone at home. I have been doing this for 23 years. I have seen a lot of things happen on this stage. I have never seen this. He paused. 2 women drove to Atlanta to play a game show. They are identical twins. They have both been putting people back together for their entire careers, one in rehabilitation, one in post-surgical recovery. Without knowing they were doing it in parallel. Without knowing the other existed. Without knowing that the shape they couldn't fill was a person who was filling the same shape, without knowing it. He stopped. I don't know what to call that except. The world is more connected than we can see. And sometimes the connection has been there your whole life, waiting for one room to go quiet enough for you to find it. The episode aired 11 weeks after the taping, delayed by the legal and administrative process of verifying the adoption records, which the network handled with extraordinary care. In the first 48 hours after airing, 112 million views, the highest 48-hour total in the show's history. By the end of the week, 328 million. The hashtag You've Been Here All Along trended in 51 countries for 18 days. Every major network ran segments. A legal scholar cited the clip in a paper on closed adoption policy reform. 3 countries with sealed adoption record laws saw formal legislative proposals to open those records introduced within 60 days of the clip's release. Today, Renee and CJ talk every day. Not always for long. Sometimes just a text. Sometimes a voice message. Sometimes a call that lasts 2 hours without either of them noticing the time. They visited each other's cities within the first month. Renee to Indianapolis, CJ to Columbus. They stood in Renee's kitchen the first evening and made dinner together and discovered, without having planned it, that they both cut onions the same way, half first, then quarters, then the specific diagonal slice that is not the most efficient method, but is the one both of their hands knew without being taught. CJ said, "How do you cut onions like that?" Renee said, "I don't know. I've always done it that way." They looked at each other across the cutting board. Vivian is in therapy. She has been since the week after the taping. She says the therapist is good, and that the work is hard, and that she is doing it because she owes it to both of her daughters, which is the first time she has used the word both in 34 years, and which she says still feels strange in her mouth and right in her chest simultaneously. She has met Renee's adoptive parents, Robert and Margaret Caldwell, who came to Indianapolis 4 months after the taping and sat at Vivian's kitchen table and said, simply, "Thank you for giving us our daughter." Vivian had not known how to respond to that for a long moment. Then she had said, "Thank you for being there when I couldn't be." They had stayed for dinner. Margaret had brought a pie. The Same Hands Foundation was established by Steve Harvey 5 months after the taping, dedicated to funding DNA reunion services for adoptees and birth families, supporting open adoption record legislation advocacy, and providing counseling resources for families navigating reunion processes. The motto, from CJ's first words when she looked at Renee, "She has my hands." In its first year, the foundation facilitated 890 family reunion connections across 31 states, funded full legal record opening processes for 340 adoptees, and partnered with 12 adoption advocacy organizations to lobby for closed record reform in 7 states. Renee and CJ are both 35 now. They celebrated their birthday together for the first time last November. In Indianapolis, at Vivian's house, with both families at the table. There was a cake. Renee's adoptive father, Robert, made a toast. He said, "To the part of the story we didn't know." CJ's aunt said, "To the part we get to know now." They ate cake. They sat at the table for 4 hours. Nobody wanted to be the first to leave. There is a photograph from that evening, taken by Marcus on his phone, slightly blurred because the kitchen light was low, of Renee and CJ sitting side by side at Vivian's kitchen table, their hands resting next to each other on the tablecloth. The hands are identical. The same length fingers, the same slight curve of the thumb, the same way of resting, palm flat, fingers slightly open, that neither of them was taught, and both of them know. Renee has it as her phone wallpaper. CJ has it framed on her desk at the hospital, next to the window that faces east, which means light in the morning. 2 women drove to Atlanta to play a game show and found the piece of themselves they had been working around for 34 years. They had been putting people back together their whole lives without knowing they were built from the same blueprint. They had been carrying the shape of each other in the space they could not fill, which is not a metaphor, but the closest language can get to what it actually is. The specific, biological, unreasonable fact of a person who shares your exact design existing in the world without you. And the moment you stop being without each other, which turns out to look like 2 women standing 3 feet apart on a stage in Atlanta, looking at each other's hands and knowing. If this incredible story of Renee and CJ and the 34 years that dissolved in a single moment moved your heart, make sure to subscribe and hit that thumbs up button. Share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that what is lost is not always gone, and that what we are missing sometimes finds us in the most impossible places. Have you ever found someone you didn't know you were looking for? Or been reunited with a piece of your story you had stopped expecting to recover? Let us know in the comments and ring that notification bell for more stories that remind us what family truly means.